Last year, J.D. Vance showed up at the Munich Security Conference castigating European leaders for freeloading on America's military. This year, Marco Rubio landed with a Valentine's Day card. Let's stay together, forever, he crooned. Come on, we've all seen this routine before. Starsky and Hutch, Cagney and Lacey, Bodie and Doyle, Kermit and Miss Piggy. Now Rubio and Vance, good cop, bad cop. Surely Europe won't fall for that. Actually, looks like they might do. The American Secretary of State won a standing ovation, but he hasn't got Greenland yet. The Prime Minister promised that he'd send British troops to the far north to fend off invaders. To be clear, he was talking about Russians in the Arctic, not reform in Manchester. The Home Secretary wants to prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. She fought the law won. Battles at home and abroad, it would seem. Plenty to dive into with the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who joins us live from Munich. Also in the Bavarian capital is her Conservative shadow, Dame Priti Patel. For Reform UK, their head of policy, Zia Yusuf, will be live in the studio. And for the Greens, their leader, Zack Polanski. Plus, with us throughout the show, journalist and broadcaster Steve Richards, the Eye's chief political commentator, Kitty Donaldson, and the journalist and director of the London Defence Conference, Ian Martin. Okay, tell me if we're getting there. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. This weekend, nearly 50 of the world's major leaders gathered in Munich for the annual Security Conference. Traditionally, they come to praise the international rules-based order that they claim has kept the peace in Europe since 1945. This year, it seems they came to bury it. On Friday, the host, Germany's Friedrich Merz, told delegates that the international order no longer exists, laying the blame squarely on the Trump White House. Our own Prime Minister yesterday argued that Europe was going to have to stand on its own 2 feet, to quote him. Yesterday, the Americans replied. Secretary of State Marco Rubio basically said, yep, you're right. The conventions and institutions that were supposed to make the rules work are no longer doing the job. For example, according to Rubio, the United Nations blew it in Gaza, failed to prevent Iran building nuclear weapons, and stood idly by while drug dealers took over in Venezuela, leaving America to do all the dirty work. And he said, you lot in Europe, you're allowing your Christian culture to be threatened by mass migration, and you're still not paying your way on defence. We, the United States, he said, can no longer place the so-called global order above the vital interests of our people and our nation. We have no interest in being polite and orderly caretakers of the West's managed decline. Well, polite he was not, but imagine what we'd have heard if they'd sent the bad cop. Let's start as ever with the government. Live from Munich, I could speak now to the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper. Good morning, Foreign Secretary.
Good morning, Trevor.
Can we start with this extraordinary report of the killing of Alexei Navalny? It can't be a surprise that the Kremlin stands accused, but the Russian embassy this morning, I don't know if you know this, is calling your report a nonsense, quote, a mockery of the dead, quote, and describing you and other Western politicians as, quote, feeble-minded fabulists. What's your response?
Well, we have worked for the last 2 years since the announcement of Alexei Navalny's death and the announcement that took place here in Munich 2 years ago. We have worked with our European partners on pursuing the evidence and pursuing the truth. And that is why we have together found the evidence of this lethal toxin that was found in Alexei Navalny's body at the time he died. And only the Russian regime had the motive, the means and the opportunity to administer this lethal poison while he was in prison in Russia. They wanted to silence him because he was a critic of their regime. And that's why we have exposed this barbaric Kremlin plot to do so, and made sure that we have done so with evidence as well. And you know, the reason as well that we have done this is it's one of the things that Alexei Navalny himself said, that he said, tell the truth, spread the truth, that is the most dangerous weapon of all. The Russian regime tried to stop him doing so, so we have done so instead.
Do you know from the investigation that's been done whether this was, how can I put this, was this from frog, or in fact it would be hundreds of frogs, wouldn't it? Or was it done in a laboratory?
So I can't tell you the details of that, but as you say, this is a particular chemical. It can be produced synthetically. It can also be found in this particular frog in Ecuador. And we do know that the Russian regime has had possession of this particular chemical. It is obviously not one that is found in naturally in Russia.
On broader matters, the Chancellor German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that the rules-based international orders collapsed. Marco Rubio, on the other hand, says, don't worry about it. It's all pretty much as it was, as long as you guys pay your way. Who's right?
Well, we're certainly seeing huge global instability that we've not had in previous decades. I think the first significant thing is that the peace dividend we had hoped for after the Cold War, that is completely gone. And we're seeing this Russian aggression as a persistent threat now, not something that's going to go away, that threat to Europe that we have to respond to. We're also seeing the US shift its focus. As we heard from Marco Rubio yesterday, that NATO alliance is still immensely strong and important, and the transatlantic partnership is still very strong and important for our security. However, they are changing their focus, and they are no longer going to be funding the whole of so much of Europe's security as the US did in the past, and that means that Europe has to step up to the plate, and the UK is part of that, and that is exactly what we're doing, because we have to make sure we can protect Britain's national security and do so in partnership with our allies. We're also seeing very big changes across the world more widely, very big economic changes with the rise of China economically, but also much more protectionism, the use of tariffs or economic coercion around export controls on rare earths. So many of these different things that are changing across the world. What I would say in response to that, though, is that things like international law still really matter. Frameworks like the United Nations still really matter, and alliances like NATO still really matter. All of that is going to change. We have to use them differently, but they do remain important, and they're important for our values and our interests. Sorry, Trevor.
No. Rubio talked about the importance of hard power, and from what you've just said, it sounds as though America's hard power is less likely to be placed at the disposal of Europe. And the Prime Minister said yesterday, Europe's got to stand on its own 2 feet and so forth. How's that going to happen? Our biggest warship needs American ships to supply it if it's going anywhere. Submarines have to go to the United States to pick up missiles. How quickly do you think we can, or Europe can, effectively reduce its dependency on the United States?
So that transatlantic partnership remains very important, but we have to do more ourselves as well. So one of the things, for example, the UK is doing with Norway is developing a new fleet of joint frigates that can strengthen our maritime security. Particularly, that means recognising the threats from the Russian Northern Fleet that is to the north of Norway and through the Arctic as well. So we're doing that directly with Norway, and we're going to need to go further, strengthening our defence in partnership with other European countries, because that is where some of those threats, particularly from Russia, are most heavily felt. But we've also got to work on things like cyber threats and those hybrid threats that can come from different quarters too.
OK. A couple of quick questions on Russia. Where are we on the unfreezing of Roman Abramovich's assets in London, which you said would be taken to help the Ukrainians buy more weapons?
So the assets, this was from the sale of Chelsea. because we believe that those assets should go to support the people of Ukraine. These particular funds, and we're talking about billions of pounds, were allocated to go for Ukrainian charities to be able to help the Ukrainian people. And we want to see the progress made. Roman Abramovich has had many opportunities to do the right thing, as was agreed at the time of the sale of Chelsea. We have now put forward a new licence process that will require him to do this, and we are ready to take legal action if he doesn't make the shift, transfer that money so that it can be used to support children and people in Ukraine.
You did threaten him with the courts pretty much, I think, 6 weeks ago. Shouldn't you just get on with it?
We said that we would give him time to comply. That is following proper process.
He has had 2 or 3 years to comply already.
Yes.
He has had 2 or 3 years. I mean, he can afford it, can't he?
Time to apply. Yes. Yes, he can. He absolutely can, and he should do this because this is money that he holds from the sale of Chelsea, and we know that this has been a huge benefits as a result of the Russian regime, and we think that money needs to go for the people of Ukraine. He has got this final chance now. The clock is ticking on him. He needs to act, otherwise we will take court action.
The High Court in London this week ruled that your decision to prescribe Palestine Action was disproportionate. What led you to take that decision other than the spray painting of some military aircraft? This was criminal damage, but it wasn't terrorism, was it?
Well, I followed the clear advice and recommendations, going through a serious process that the Home Office goes through, involving different agencies and police advice as well, which was very clear about the recommendation for prescription of this group. And the court has also concluded that this is not a normal protest group, that it has found that this group has committed acts of terrorism, that this group is not simply in line with democratic values and has promoted violence.
Forgive me.
The Home Secretary, let me just finish the point. The Home Secretary has appealed on the grounds on which the government lost. But look, in the end, the decision for a Home Secretary is what you always have to do is take really seriously advice that you're given. And if you're given advice about potential risks of violence and risks to public safety, you have to take that advice very seriously. This is very different
the High Court
from issues around protest on Palestine. People still have a legal right, and
you did say you said at the time you'd consulted a wide range of experts. And you just told us that again. The judge this week said that your experts, your evidence was not convincing that this was terrorism. By the way, there are a number of Labour MPs who agree and think that you shouldn't pursue this. What evidence did you actually have that this was terrorism as opposed to, if you like, the standard criminal damage or inconvenience or other kinds of offences which don't get into the cross the threshold into terrorism?
So I was given significant evidence and advice around risks of violence and risks to public safety, and that is what you take seriously.
They got it wrong then, didn't they?
Home Secretary, and if you ignore advice that you are given about risks to public safety, then you're really not taking seriously the responsibilities of the Home Secretary. That's what you have to do. Now remember,
I'm not inviting criticism
that this
of
is going to be appealed. The Home Secretary has appealed.
I'm not inviting criticism of you, but clearly the advice that you were given by the police, by the intelligence services, didn't stack up for, if you like, what the courts call the reasonable person, and certainly the judge is in this case. Do you think that there's something that we need to look at in the way that we, the kind of advice that you and other Home Secretaries get?
Well, the current Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has looked again at this and looked at both the judgment of the court and also the advice that she is being given. And she's been clear that she disagrees with this decision, and that is why the Home Office is appealing. So, look, this is going to go to appeal, so that will mean that there will be another chance for the legal system to consider this. But I would just say, when you're faced with advice around public safety threats, it's really important to take those seriously. And I think you and everybody else would expect Home Secretaries to take very seriously the advice about public safety, the advice about threats to be taken very seriously.
The Prime Minister told other leaders at the Munich conference yesterday, none of whom has a vote in our elections, that they should beware the Greens and the Reform Party. Why was that necessary? What's it to do with them?
Well, the Prime Minister was making a speech broadly yesterday that would obviously be seen more widely. It was reported in the UK. It was also listened to in the hall in the Munich Security Conference by people from all over Europe and across the world. And I think there is a wider issue here that, in the end, our national security depends on us having partnerships abroad, that those make us stronger at home. NATO, the NATO alliance, is really important to that. And we have seen both Reform and the Greens undermine that commitment to the NATO alliance. I think that is hugely important because I think our national security...
What has Nigel Farage said or done that undermines NATO?
Which they are not doing so.
What has Nigel Farage said or done that undermines NATO?
We've seen Reform have not taken seriously the threat from Russia. They have refused and failed to do an investigation into Russian interference within their own party, despite the fact that their Welsh leader was convicted of the links, the real serious problems in terms of the links to Russia. They have not taken seriously. They have too often, I think, dismissed the aggression and the threat from Russia, even at a time when we've seen lethal poisons being used once again, just as we saw in Salisbury. So I do take that extremely seriously, and I think it is a problem that Reform don't.
Without revealing my age or vintage here, are you accusing Reform of being a fifth column?
Now, I'm accusing them of not taking this seriously enough. And look, in the end, when you're talking about our national security, it's important, and you can't just, sort of just swan around making comments and saying the easy things and just shooting from the hip. This is really important.
Well, let me give you another...
Our relationships with other countries are important because that is what makes Britain stronger at home.
Let me give you another way in which we might have read what the Prime Minister said yesterday, which is that it was a signal to our allies of how rattled he is that he has to go to Munich to complain about domestic political opponents, Reform and the Greens. And the message to our allies is that this guy's on his way out, and there's no point doing deals with him or with you.
Well, I don't think that's the case at all. And the partnerships that Keir Starmer has built with other leaders, the work that we are doing together is immensely important. And what's what I see here at the Munich Security Conference is the respect towards the UK, towards the Prime Minister for the work that he's done, the leadership he's shown. And that is the fact that the UK has done this work, for example, with our partners on identifying the lethal poison in the case of Alexei Navalny. That is us stepping up and showing we are going to shine the spotlight on Russian aggression. We are not just operating in isolation. We're working with our partners to tackle threats. The work that's being done with Norway on the frigates that I referred to, the work that's being done with the US on strengthening security. Across the board, we work in partnership. That's what makes us stronger at home.
If I may, can I just finally take you to a question, to be honest, which none of us particularly want to ask, and none of you, I don't suppose any of you want to talk about, but we must. The case of Lord Doyle, who it is said campaigned for a man convicted of sexual offences standing in local elections in 2017. Are you now confident that there are no more skeletons in the closet? No one else in your administration campaigned for Sean Morton?
Well, look, I think there's clearly been some significant process failures in this appointment. There is still a review underway on that, but there clearly have been some process failures. We do take this extremely seriously. Keir Starmer has obviously made the importance, talked about the importance of standards in public life, and that's why we take this so seriously. And some of the things we've, I think, obviously had discussions about individual cases. For me, that there is just a wider issue here, which is that I personally, obviously in opposition, made it Labour's mission to halve violence against women and girls in a decade, and also in the Home Office made that a central mission for the government. And now in the Foreign Office, I'm making it a priority as part of our foreign policy across the world. And I do think those are the issues we have to take seriously. We have to always be focusing on the voices of victims and survivors, and that should be at the heart of what we do.
And this is, let me be clear, this is not some kind of gotcha question. I think this issue is too serious for that. But what I am hearing is that given the apparent failures in the Mandelson case, now in this Doyle case, you can't say to me that the processes that operate now can assure you completely that this administration, or indeed any other, will be clean of people who associate with people like Sean Morton or Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, what I can say is that we have strengthened the processes. In the appointment of the new ambassador to the US, we did strengthen the processes and to ensure in advance of the appointment, and I take that very seriously. Though, of course, there can always be real concerns about people, about unknown cases where people have committed crimes in different areas. There always has to be a robust response, but you also have to make sure that you've got proper processes in advance as well.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
All right, let's get a verdict from our panel around the desk this morning. Are the journalist and broadcaster Steve Richards, the Eye's chief political commentator Kitty Donaldson, and the director of the London Defence Conference, Ian Martin, who has just come back from Munich. Ian, what did you make of Rubio's speech, which I guess was a big moment yesterday?
Yeah, it was a big moment, and but in a way, nothing has changed really. You know, he was delivering a message which is just in a nicer way. You know, the reality is, the Americans have been saying this since the 50s and the 60s. Eisenhower was the first privately. JFK. It's always been the American expectation that at some point they'd do less in Europe. So we might not like some of the language, but this is just the reality of where we're headed. That the US is drawing back to what it terms the homeland, and its main competition is with China in the Indo-Pacific, and that means that Europe is going to have to do more to take care of its own security. Now, I would like to keep, America in that relationship as much as possible, but that's just the kind of raw fact, and from that then flow. And the Prime Minister's right. That means we're now in an era of hard power, and from that flow all sorts of questions about how we fund defence and how we up our capabilities and up our game fast.
I was going to say, Kitty, there's this, the implication that everybody accepting that everything's changed, and Yvette Cooper pretty much said that, is one of the things changed is the money.
Well, absolutely. And how quickly we get to that defence settlement is going to be the question that sort of dominates the rest of this parliament and will dominate the next election, and how much people are prepared, how much political parties are prepared to put towards defence spending. And I think that is a big question for reform, actually, and I think you will find the Labour Party, the government, making that point over and over again. They think that reform is weak on several fronts. One is that they say that reform would nationalise the NHS. You'll find that a lot up in Manchester at this by-election. The second is links to Russia, as Yvette Cooper was just saying. And the third is on defence spending. And I think as as reform works through its spending plans, we will see a lot of questions about actually will they put their money where their mouth is.
Steve, we'll talk a little bit more about reform after we've spoken to Zia Yusuf. But I was very struck. It's quite unusual, I think, for a Prime Minister to go to a big foreign jamboree like this and then bang on about reform and the Greens.
Well, he's got a protective shield in that he was arguing that their defence policies are what is one of the big problems with them. So that was the context. But you're right. I mean, he's under huge domestic pressure and therefore will not waste a single opportunity in that respect. But I think what's really interesting about what Yvette Cooper was saying just now to you is, in the context of defence spending and all the rest of it, she was stressing again the need for cooperation with Germany and France. And I wonder whether we're going to get to a place, because I don't think we will have the money to get to 5% quickly, as Ian wants. We just haven't got the money. Whether, ironically, post-Brexit, we move to a place where actually cooperation with some of these European countries becomes much stronger on defence than was the case when we were in the European Union, where countries acted wholly freely. Look at Iraq, where Britain went one way, Germany and France another. Because to match the demands of defence spending as separate countries, I think is going to prove impossible. And that we won't get to 5% in the next 10 seconds, which is what some want.
Ian, there's the money, but there's also the technical side of this. How quickly, if at all, can we detach ourselves from the American military operation?
In terms of the UK, you mean?
Yeah.
With great difficulty. I think a lot of the debate that Steve is referring to on the European side in the UK is basically fantastical. I think we should be clear-sighted about how connected and interwoven British forces are with the US on intelligence, on security, and on operations. And it's just a basic fact, reality, that America has capabilities in Europe that we just don't have enough of, like heavy lift. That's basically how you move
big
stuff around.
That will carry tanks and all of that.
We have some of that, but America has vastly more of it. So I think we have to begin from a realistic standpoint. It's not about America leaving entirely. It's about America drawing back. And actually, I think, Steve, you're in danger of then mixing up the EU and NATO. What's going to matter?
Let me be clear with what I was saying. I'm not saying that we should break with America. I'm saying, as you have said, coming back from Munich, the American message to us hasn't changed. And therefore, there has to be a response to that, which is coordinated at a point where these European countries have common interests in relation to security and defence.
And the mechanism...
I'm not saying break with America. I'm saying, look, I'm responding to what your assessment is, that Rubio was not saying anything different to Vance. America is distancing itself from Europe.
And the mechanism for that is the European pillar of NATO. Right? That's which is a concept which exists. That is going to have to be built up. There are all sorts of academic papers about how that can be done. That's the work. Rather than creating something new and some new kind of institution, you build on what exists at the moment, NATO, and say to the Americans that non-US Europe is doing more through NATO.
Kitty, the other thing we talked about was this Palestine Action. Is this embarrassing for the government?
I think it's a setback, definitely, and I think it's embarrassing that they couldn't, that their case wasn't legally watertight. My general feeling on this is that all the people who legitimately want to make a stand about the suffering of people, and children in Palestine should have a mechanism to do so. But I would be looking at starting a new group, perhaps, that's not called just leave Palestine Action to one side, except that the minority of the people in it who are engaged in acts that aren't legal should be planted one side, and there should be a new grouping.
Almost certainly that's what's going to happen, isn't it?
I would imagine so, because, you know, it has led to perverse outcomes. The number of emails I get from 80-year-olds who've been arrested on marches, where, you know, the first time in their lives they've been arrested, and they were out marching for a kind of independent Palestine state, which is now government policy, and they're arrested. And this is, Yvette Cooper says absolutely what happened. She got this advice and had to take it. But this court judgment, I've read it, is unequivocal. And, I suspect they'll lose the appeal, actually.
All right. It has just gone 9 o'clock, so let's cross over to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, in Munich. Deborah, you were listening to our interview with the Foreign Secretary. What did you make of it?
Well, I thought it was really interesting. She was obviously very robust in pushing back against those Kremlin rebukes in response to the UK and other allies coming out yesterday very strongly, accusing Vladimir Putin's regime of effectively using a poison, an exotic-sounding neurotoxin that's classed as a chemical weapon to kill Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. And I thought she said something pretty significant when you were pushing her on where this toxin came from. We know that it's found in the skin of Ecuadorian dart frogs. It's highly poisonous, used by indigenous tribes in South America. They put them on darts when they hunt. But they can also, she said, be made, it can also be made synthetically. The actual poison itself is called epibatidine. That's the name, the term for it. And she said that, that they know, the UK knows, that Russia has had possession of this chemical. It's classed as a chemical weapon, and that's why the UK, France, Germany and others are going to be submitting the evidence that they say that they have gathered over the last 2 years since Alexei Navalny died in that prison in Siberia, and they're going to be presenting that evidence to the international organisation that oversees the prohibition for chemical weapons, and they will be hoping that that will be putting pressure on Russia, potentially then leading to sanctions and real-life consequences for what they are saying very clearly is the deliberate murder of an opposition leader, someone that Vladimir Putin regarded as his #1 opponent inside Russia.
So this is going to go on. Do you think the Russians, how can I put this? Do you think the Russians care?
They don't. They care insofar as it's not a great look, is it? But in terms of changing behaviour, which clearly is what calling out this kind of activity is designed to try to do, the past, the track record of the past, doesn't give you a huge amount of hope. You'll remember, of course, that it's quite sort of you get quite flashbacks of what happened when Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were targeted with a deadly nerve agent, another deadly nerve agent, Novichok, on the streets of Salisbury in 2018. And you can remember the rolling news that happened as more came out about the kind of poison that was used, and then the accusations that this was again a targeted, attempted assassination by the Russian state. And again, evidence drawn from intelligence that Russia possessed this Novichok nerve agent. And again, of course, the Russian denials. On that occasion, it was then followed by that extraordinary expulsion of diplomats. There were sanctions. But in terms of whether it changed behaviour, the fact that Russia then went on to try to kill Navalny in 2020 with that same Novichok poison, allegedly, and then again, what we're seeing now, actually achieving, if it is confirmed, the goal of silencing this arch critic. I actually spoke to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who is here as well in Munich, and asked him if he was worried that he might be next. And he said, of course, he is concerned about that, but he can't keep thinking about that kind of thing when his country is fighting a war.
Just very quickly, Deborah, I've got to ask you this. You're getting used to all of this, but do you sometimes feel that you're in a Freddie Forsyth novel?
It was fun. Well, when you go to these press conferences, or, you go to these briefings, you're told about a briefing, you're told it's going to be important, and sometimes, it may be the people telling you it's important maybe have a different idea of what makes news, but standing there yesterday morning and hearing the Foreign Secretary utter the words, a deadly toxin that's found in an Ecuadorian dart frog, I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary thing to hear. And but also incredibly serious. Clearly the UK, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands and France, their top scientists have been working flat out to try to identify this poison and make it public. So they are clearly confident in what they are saying. And that means if what they are saying is true, and of course Russia is strongly denying that, then what does it say about the Kremlin if they are willing to use such ruthless techniques to silence those that may dare to challenge the leader?
OK. Deb, thank you so much for your time this morning. Let's stay in Munich. Just before the programme, I spoke to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Dame Priti Patel. Priti Patel, the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, says that the rules-based international order has collapsed. Marco Rubio, the American Secretary of State, on the other hand, says that the old relationships are still intact. Who's right?
Well, look, here at the Munich Security Conference, we've heard a lot of strong views in terms of the political situation, geopolitical situation that we all find ourselves in. They are both right in many of the points that they've made. And the fact of the matter is, Trevor, you and I have discussed this before, the old world, the world that we know post-Cold War is dead. It's long gone. And we have to deal with the reality of the world in which we find it. And on that basis alone, that means all of us, whether we're working through our key partnerships such as NATO, the transatlantic partnership, or with our European colleagues, we have to really step up and learn to really be strong and grip some of the major issues that are testing and challenging all our countries, and really find pragmatic solutions to deal with these big threats and these big challenges to our democratic values, our freedoms, and also to the territorial sovereignty and integrity of many of our nation states.
It's interesting, you said that the old world is dead, and there are different views about who was holding the knife. Some people will say that it's Putin, but others, including, for example, Mark Carney of Canada, and definitely Friedrich Merz, saying that actually it's Donald Trump.
Well, look, the reality is that certainly from our perspective, we face major challenges on the axis of authoritarianism. That is Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. We can see that self-evidently in Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. That's a threat to our country. Russia is a threat to our country. We know that. We've experienced this over the last decade with state-sponsored poisonings, with all the permissive activity that has taken place in our own country. So we absolutely do work with America. America is a natural ally, it's a partner. Look at what America has done in terms of getting NATO countries to step up when it comes to more in the deterrence front, funding NATO, actually taking on more responsibility when it comes to our security and the funding and intelligence and security partnerships and cooperation. That's welcome, and certainly from our perspective, we would stand by that. And when it comes to the real threats and the challenges to Britain and to many of our allies, I would argue that it sits firmly with the axis of authoritarianism.
Well, you say that we've got to take more responsibility, but we're essentially locked into the Americans. Our warships need American supply ships. Our submarines have got to go to the United States to pick up missiles if they're going to reload. The truth of the matter is that we are still completely and wholly dependent on the Americans. And I wonder if you believe, after all you've heard, that they are still a reliable ally.
Well, I would answer that, Trevor, very directly and say, yes, they are. Not only are they our reliable ally, they are our strategic partner and a long-term ally of the United Kingdom.
You completely trust Donald Trump to deliver on his word?
I do not subscribe, Trevor, to those voices, and they're in the minority, actually, that want to create further division. This is a time for stronger unity. We should be concentrating on who the real threat and the enemy is to freedom, democracy, our democratic values, our Western values. And quite frankly, we need to
how does that square with Donald Trump's desire to annex Greenland?
Well, look, I mean, we have discussed this previously. you know, any discussion around annexing Greenland is completely wrong, and that is not right, and he was proposing that by force. I've been in many forums here at the Munich Security Conference, including with the Prime Minister of Denmark and representatives from Greenland and other key countries and allies, where we all spoke with one voice, and this is the point. We cannot be divisive at a time when we all need to be working together. This isn't about one country in the Western Alliance that has greater prominence. We all have different equities and we all have different contributions to make. We can no longer keep on reinventing the wheel. We have to put our money where our mouth is. At this particular moment in time, when it comes to defence and security, we need hard cash, we need greater cooperation and collaboration. And quite frankly, that's what I and my party are pushing the British government to do much more on. And I think the biggest message coming out of the Munich Security Conference is not just about the keynote speeches. It's effectively about being practical and pragmatic and how we work together to deliver on our collective security. And I say that, you know, we are a leading country in NATO. We've contributed to our shared security, peace through strength, for so long, and we fundamentally believe in that. And Britain has a role to play to continue to defend that and work towards that.
Let's talk about something that's happening here at home. Was the High Court right to throw out the proscription of Palestine Action?
Well, look, I'm pretty appalled by that ruling, and clearly it's now going to be subject to a legal appeal, and I think it's right that it should be appealed. It really is right. What I find so extraordinary is that the individuals involved in Palestine Action, they have been causing millions upon millions of pounds of criminal damage to military equipment, to public equipment, to public places. And the High Court took that
They spray-painted a plane.
So it's got to be challenged. Pardon?
They spray-painted a plane and some elderly ladies held up some placards. Really?
Well, actually, yes, really, Trevor, because we also know that over many years, they have been breaking into defence facilities, into defence companies. They've been scaling their buildings and breaking in through the roofs. They've been causing criminal damage. There's plenty of evidence out there. And I think it is absolutely right. The public would expect, quite frankly, to the laws of our land to be upheld. Those that are involved in criminal damage, particularly against military equipments and, you know, public places and even private businesses, that prosecution should take place.
Do you think, so you're supporting the Home Secretary in following this up, but the sort of things that you've been talking about, for example, breaking and entering, I mean, it's criminal, but is it terrorism?
Well, look, first of all, they've got a history. This organisation has a long history. This isn't just a recent, in the last 6 months or the last 12 months. This prescription is not just based upon their recent activity. It is based upon the way in which they organise themselves, the way in which they plan their attacks. And it is right that they feel the full force of our laws, including the prescription that has been put in place. They are on par with, you know, how terrorist organisations conduct themselves and they plan their attacks. So what I would say, this is subject now to further legal action. I think that is right that that there is an appeal that is going to take place. We absolutely support that. But I think the public would be absolutely horrified to see that these individuals have been able to essentially get away with the type of activity that they have been able to thus far.
Can I just come back to Mr. Rubio's speech yesterday and area that you were once in charge of? Marco Rubio criticised the Europeans for their failures on mass migration. And he said that migration threatens the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our cultures, and he referred specifically to Christian culture, and the future of our people. Do you agree?
Well, look, first of all, you know where we stand on migration issues, and you know where I stand as well through particularly illegal migrations and many of the policies that I've been a strong advocate for. You know what I think is telling? I think it's really telling that, again, this is raised here at the Security Conference, because migration, when it's not kept in check, is a threat to our nation states. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen homegrown terrorism. We've seen all sorts of activities in the past in our country. We still see these issues. We now see them across Europe. And I have to say, Trevor, when I was Home Secretary, certainly on the illegal migration front, I was speaking about this very vocally to many of our European allies that were simply not prepared to take action. And now it's a really big threat and an issue to them, and they're all having to wake up and deal with these issues. And I've had conversations even in Munich with the German minister, the deputy minister for Interior, about some of these very, very big and significant challenges that they and other European countries are facing.
Priti Patel, Shadow Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Steve Richards, Kitty Donaldson and Ian Martin were watching that. And tempting as it is to get into Ecuadorian frogs and so on, Steve, I'm very struck by Rubio's speech, part of Rubio's speech where he talked about migration and he talked about its threat to the culture of the West, particularly the Christian culture.
And that's where it had a precise echo with Vance's speech a year ago, which focused on this in a more provocative way. It is so confused and sweeping. And it's interesting that Priti Patel, in your interview, sort of wanted to be supportive of it, but focused solely on illegal migration, whereas Rubio was far more sweeping in his confused way because the United States is formed by migration. And this obsession...
To be fair, he does say that at some length. He talked about, in his speech, he talked about the fact that he is the descendant of Spanish migrants and so on.
They all do that. They all do that. And then say Europe is this decadent place because of migration. And then British politicians have to focus on illegal migration. And so I think the whole debate from that US perspective is confused and too sweeping and full of a kind of instinctive prejudice against their view of a decadent Europe. And as I say, it's just not based on thought through arguments. And that's often what happens when you get to sort of culture wars. It's more of an instinct and prejudice.
This is an issue which is, to some extent, being argued about in the government, isn't it? About how important are these questions. You know, the blue Labour types like Shabana Mahmood think they're very important. Some others think that's not politics.
Yeah, and I think we saw our sort of version of this last week with the Jim Ratcliffe comments about migration in this.
Ed Conway's Sky interview.
Yes, exactly. And he used the word colonisation, which was interesting because then it allowed the Prime Minister, which I was quite surprised that he turned around so quickly and said, absolutely wrong, jumped in on this. I thought it could have been left to people below his pay grade, but clearly he thinks it's something that needs addressing. And then on the other side of the argument, you had Nigel Farage, who takes a very sort of American take on this and said the only thing wrong with Jim Ratcliffe's comments was the word colonisation. And actually, going to Steve's point, you're talking to a gut feeling that is articulated more in America, but is also present here, I think, as well. And it's sort of the big difference in America is that they've got these kind of low-level thugs as ICE agents, as these guys who keep going around messing up by shooting people, And the difference here is we don't have that. I'd just be interested to see what this will look like in the coming years.
Ian, do you think this is important? I mean, one of the things that I've heard people say is the departure of Morgan McSweeney, who I think thought all of these kinds of things are important, means that the government is now going to go down the strategy of basically saying, reform, bunch of racists, end of story. We're not that interested in these culture war questions.
I think that's a mistake if Labour does that, but I think that's where it's headed, in a more kind of classic soft left direction. But if you look at the opinion polling on this, it's actually pretty clear that public attitudes have hardened substantially. I'm sure we'll get into later discussing the politics of all of that. Just on the Rubio point, I mean, I'm always amused by this, but we sometimes forget how these things are usually about American domestic politics. So almost everything that happens that's said by a senior American has a kind of domestic component to it. And I think on this, you could read it as Rubio saying something that Vance would agree with. And Vance did then tweet, or on X then say, a fantastic speech from Secretary Rubio. And they're presenting themselves as a potential joint ticket, which is what Trump has floated. But they're really the two potential runners and riders for the nomination. And I'm just back from Washington, last week. Everyone's talking non-stop about the midterm elections, and then what's the read across to 28? And so already,
presidential election,
you can just feel the American system. It's on a 2-year cycle, and it's constantly, thinking about the next election.
Yeah. Okay, next presidential campaign begins here. A little later, Zack Polanski is in the studio, but first, Reform's Zia Yusuf.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist? I'm going to take you behind the scenes here for Election Night Live. They have gone up and up. Big Sky News journalist. Ed Conway. Sky News, is anyone going to talk to us? Mortgage rates did go up very sharply during your time in office. Here it is. First off, just the scale of what we're looking at. Our data shows it's been happening. Question is, why it hasn't been stopped.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?
We've done the work and the reading, so you don't have to.
Being a Sky News presenter.
Hello and welcome. Westminster, the heart of British politics.
I'm so sorry about what happened to you.
So what on earth is going on?
It's not true.
Can I tell you what I think? It's really unusual. Mornings with Richard and Frost. Let's crack on. Let's get started.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
Who's funnier?
Being a Sky News journalist.
A special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim.
Pakistan has the right to respond.
You're like, what?
Historic day here today. Congratulations, this is a huge moment. But what happens now?
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
They call him the king of the jungle.
Being a Sky News journalist.
Yusra Al-Baghir has this report.
And this is what's left of it.
As a woman of colour, how did the Harris campaign speak to you?
People risk their lives to speak to us for this report.
Mr. Zuma, Sky News.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
Well, let's turn to Reform UK now. I'm joined by their head of policy, Zia Yusuf. Prime Minister said in Munich yesterday that your party's pro-Putin. If you were in power in the United Kingdom, you would have joined the coalition of the willing, and we'd be a country that nobody could do business with. Do you agree?
No, it would be quite the opposite. I mean, this is a country now that has basically no economic growth, confirmed again with the latest GDP print. We have a Prime Minister who seems to go around the world trying to negotiate on this country's behalf. Why did he come back from in terms of China? All he did was come back and our interests further diminished. This is a Prime Minister who has chosen voluntarily to cede our sovereign British territory in the form of the Chagos Islands and then spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money to lease it back. This is a laughable joke of a Prime Minister who now, because he is so unpopular, frankly, it's actually a very dangerous thing to do, Trevor, because this is a dangerous time in the world. And we need a leader who is actually going to put the interests of British people first. And what he's doing is responding to his appalling approval ratings at home by sabre-rattling abroad and attacking Nigel Farage.
Yeah, but he said yesterday, and indeed the Foreign Secretary said this morning, that the very same Nigel Farage, soft on Russia, bit pro-Putin.
That's obviously not true. I mean, Nigel was the
Yeah,
only...
Nigel did say he admired Putin.
Nigel is the only political leader in this country who has confirmed on air that he would indeed shoot down Russian aircraft if they encroached into NATO airspace. Not a single other political leader said that, nor has Keir Starmer. We are crystal clear at Reform. We need Britain. This is a new era. We totally agree. This is a new world order that is emerging now. Britain must start growing again. We need to rebuild. We need to rebuild our manufacturing capability. We need to rearm, and we need to compete on the global stage. What we are doing at the moment, what we had for 14 years under the Tories and continuing under Labour, is the total gutting and destruction of our manufacturing capability. Trevor, we produce fewer cars today than we did 70 years ago. Not 7 years ago, 70 years ago. Our heavy industrial production is at 35-year lows. How are we going to be a powerful country in 5-10 years' time if we can't produce primary steel, if we can't produce any munitions ourselves? We have had jokes of politicians now for years, and Nigel is the only political leader who's going to change that.
You've whizzed off into a very different direction, but I just want to keep you briefly with Munich. Marco Rubio said that European leaders were allowing mass migration to threaten the cohesion of our societies, the continuity of our cultures and the future of our people. Do you agree?
I think that's obviously true, and it's not just me who thinks that. I'd argue the primary reason why Reform has led 200 opinion polls in a row. It's why the majority of this country do support, for example, the mass deportation of illegal migrants. So it's not just me who thinks that or Nigel who thinks that. I think it's demonstrably true. People are seeing just the sheer quantum of people who came. You know, the Tories promised 4 consecutive manifestos to cut net immigration to the tens of thousands, and that's important because that meant people voted time and time again for less immigration. They left office with that number at 1 million a year, let in 12 million people gross, 6 million net. People have had enough of it, Trevor. And we're now at a point where we are seeing in certain instances the erosion of British culture, and it's a really concerning thing.
Is there a danger that Reform is really, to be honest, a one-trick pony with just one prominent figure?
I don't think that's the case.
The one trick being immigration.
Well, no, I don't think that's the case at all. I think, number one, immigration is the number one salience issue for voters today, so that's important. We've talked about a whole range of other issues, but look, is immigration the number one reason why people are motivated to vote for Reform today? Yes, that is objectively true, and I'd argue that is a good thing, given how much anger and frustration now there has been in this country over the levels of immigration and the type of immigration, Trevor, both legal and illegal, for 2 decades.
All right, well, look, let's talk about policy. Your new recruit, Suella Braverman, says that she doesn't mind if you pursue what she calls socialist policies, such as owning significant chunks of strategic industries, water and energy and so on. You're a socialist wolf in right-wing clothing.
Well, look, number one, none of our policies are socialist. And if you're going to take that argument, for example, we've talked about the fact that Rolls-Royce, an amazing company that makes aerospace engines and small modular nuclear reactors, we could give them a huge contract to build that technology in the UK. And potentially, in return for that, as part of a private commercial arrangement, the state could get a stake for the taxpayer. That is exactly, by the way, what President Trump did with Intel, one of the biggest chip manufacturers in the world. So if you're going to claim that that's socialist, then you'd also have to argue that the Trump administration
I know you're
is
not
socialist
claiming,
too.
but Suella's saying it. Would you like her to sort of have a probationary period of silence?
I think Suella's been invaluable since she joined us, and I think one of the reasons why there's this back and forth for people who can be bothered to go look at it on Twitter between her and some former Tory frontbenchers is because she's the person who's saying you never had any intention of leaving the ECHR, for example. You won't leave the ECHR. So I'm afraid all of this labelling of socialists, look, the British people see past all of this stuff. What they want is manufacturing jobs coming back to Britain. We need, as a country, to be able to build things again.
All right. Let me ask you about an actual policy that you do have. Your leader changed his mind on the two-child benefit cap. He said he wanted to keep it. And then he said he would keep it and use the money raised to slash the duty on beer and business rates on pubs. Forgive me. Reform's policy is to let children go hungry so their parents can get in an extra round.
So number one, that isn't what happened. Nigel's been consistent.
That's exactly what he said.
No, hold on. So the first part of what you said was Nigel's changed his mind. That is incorrect. Nigel never changed his mind. Nigel's position has always been, and still is, that he would lift the two-child benefit cap only for British families who are in work. That has always been his position and has been misrepresented. To the second point on the pubs policy, look, what we wanted to do was make sure that this was fully funded. So the position that we have taken with regards to that policy means that that would add back £2.9 billion per year to the public purse. And we are in a position now where, having had almost 70,000 pubs in this country a couple of decades ago, we're going to be down to 10,000, Trevor, by 2040 if we carry on the way that we are. We have to support that industry.
He said it'd save the money and we would spend it to take 10% of duty on pubs, which is about 5p, I think, and fixed business rates. Does that not strike you as a bit odd? Take money away from families and children so people can drink a bit more cheaply?
Well, so firstly, it's really important people understand when the term poverty is used, primarily by left-wing politicians, let's define that term. It is a relative, hold on, it's a relative term, which means that you could literally, this is a mathematical fact, you could increase everybody's incomes tenfold and that statistic would stay the same. But the most important thing is that reform, we are fiscally prudent and we wanted to make sure anything we announced was going to be fiscally neutral.
So are you trying now to say that actually the levels of poverty that are measured by the ONS and others are somehow an illusion, that it's all a bit made up?
No, it's worse than that, because real poverty does exist in this country, Trevor, and absolute poverty does exist in very, very small pockets. If you actually want to do the right thing for as many people as possible in this country, then you need to create social mobility. That has been crushed by the Tory government and now this Labour government. If you take the relative poverty argument, then there will always be a percentage of the population that is in poverty. And what that does nothing for is to help the middle classes or indeed the people who are actually living in absolute poverty.
When you talk about small pockets of poverty, where are we finding them? What are you talking about?
Well, you can look in. Let's talk about Wales, for example, right? And this is an argument
Wales
made.
is quite a big pocket.
Well, we can talk about. So, for example, 15-year-old children in Wales score in the global PISA rankings, the most recognised international educational rankings, below the OECD average, meaningfully below, for example, countries like Turkey, to which the British taxpayer, including Welsh taxpayers, are sending tens of millions of pounds in foreign aid every year. This is an argument we have made many, many times. If we want to help British children, if we want to help British children who are struggling, then the first thing we should do, Trevor, is stop sending tens of billions of pounds of British taxpayers' money abroad to countries with their own space programs, to countries with hypersonic missiles.
I think you slid away to another point. I just asked you where the poverty is, because you're saying there's small problem. I mean, basically, you seem to be saying, actually, there's not that much poverty. Why are we bothered about it? Give people money to buy drink.
With respect, Trevor, you're putting words in my mouth. At no point did I say that. I have said that the measure of poverty that has been used for years now in this country is an unhelpful thing, because because it is relative to the mean and to the median. It means that you are always going to have a certain percentage that's there, and that is not in the interest of the people who actually need it.
Right. Zia Yusuf, we'll return for another round another time. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
In a moment, we'll continue our whip around the parties with the leader of the Greens, Zack Polanski.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
Who's funnier?
Being a Sky News journalist.
A special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim.
Pakistan had the right to respond.
You're like, what?
Historic day here today. Congratulations, this is a huge moment. But what happens now?
Time to talk to the Greens now. I'm joined by their leader, Zack Polanski. Morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Keir Starmer said yesterday that if you gain power, the lamps would go out across Europe. And he was echoing the words of the former Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, on the eve of the First World War, 1914. And he then went on to say, Grey said, "We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." How do you respond?
I think people are pretty bored of Keir Starmer making cheap political smears at other parties. People's wages are stuck in 2008. We know rent's going up, bills are going up. There's real problems both in this country and internationally. And the Green Party are offering solutions to that. And what I think Keir Starmer should be doing is actually focusing on the issues people face every single day, rather than making cheap attacks. In terms of the lights going up...
Defence against Russian aggression, for example, is pretty important. First duty of a government is to protect its people, isn't it?
Take national security really seriously. It's the first job of a Prime Minister, and actually it's the first job of a party leader. But let's talk about this Labour government. They brought in Peter Mandelson, a friend of a convicted paedophile, who was leaking secrets. That's pretty bad for national security. I don't believe they're putting the money that they need to into cybersecurity, into pandemic resilience, into the climate crisis. These are all real issues of national security, as well as protecting this country. So again, I think the Prime Minister should focus on actually getting the job done rather than cheap attacks.
He is right, though, that you would not sign up to NATO's Article 5, that is to say, to take military action in defence of another NATO country if they were invaded.
Well, we've already signed up to that, but the very obvious thing to point out is that Donald Trump, our so-called ally, who is behaving increasingly dangerously and unpredictably, is threatening to annex Greenland. An attack on one is an attack on all, and it just feels... Keir Starmer's speech yesterday, which, by the way, is not 100 miles away from what I've been saying for months now, which is we need a closer relationship with Europe. So it's quite bizarre to hear him repeating a lot of the things I've been saying and making an attack on me at the same time.
Yeah, you don't mind having a go at the Americans, but you wouldn't commit, would you, to defending a NATO country against aggression by Russia?
Oh, I absolutely would commit to that. If we're in NATO, as we are, then it's clear that we need to sign up to the articles. And Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all.
All right. In the press release today, you talk about a big brother Britain. I'm assuming that you're talking about George Orwell's Oppressive State rather than the telly programme. Isn't this going over the top a bit? I mean, this is not a country where people get thrown in jail for things, as they say, at least not very often.
Well, I think we're spiralling down that road. First of all, we saw 2,700 people potentially in prison, some of them waiting trials, a lot of them for holding up signs saying, "I oppose a genocide." We have seen a genocide happen in Israel now for the last couple of years.
No, that's not the signs that they're being arrested for. It is signs which say things like "from the river to the sea," signs which imply elimination of the state of Israel, which are, at some sense, anti-Semitic and intimidating.
Well, as a Jewish person, I don't find that anti-Semitic, and in fact, Benjamin Netanyahu himself has used that phrase. I'm one of only 5 people in British history who have been Jewish and lead a political party, so anti-Semitism needs to be taken really seriously in the same way that Islamophobia or any form of racism or hate crime needs to be taken seriously. But criticism of the Israeli government, I would say, is a moral responsibility when we're seeing what they are doing to innocent people day in, day out. And our government is not just complicit in that, they are actively enabling it. So for people who are protesting against a genocide, I would say those people are actual patriots of this country who are saying, let's have a world where we make sure we're standing for human rights. It's not just Palestine Action, though, by the way. We've seen authoritarianism over the Prime Minister wanting mandatory ID cards. We've seen the authoritarianism of scrapping jury trials. Pattern over pattern shows that Keir Starmer is deeply desperate caretaker Prime Minister who is clinging on to power by trying to crush dissent.
So you know all those 2,700 are innocent of any potential crime?
That's not true at all. So some of them have committed criminal damage. But as you've said earlier on the show, criminal damage is already illegal. That's very different from it being a terrorist attack. And it's the conflation which is dangerous, and the authoritarianism which was behind the question you asked me.
This week you celebrated a High Court decision to block the proscription of Palestine Action. You're OK with criminal damage as long as it's done in the pursuit of a cause that you're sympathetic with?
Well, I think the government have been completely shamed in court, and I'm proud that the entire Green MP group all voted against proscription of Palestine Action. Where criminal damage is committed, then of course people should face charges for that. I don't believe any protester commits criminal damage and doesn't think they'll be arrested. That, again, is very different from terrorist activity.
The reason that I'm asking you about this is that you're talking about Britain as somehow near to being a police state, an oppressive state, in a world where, you know, we heard this morning Alex Navalny is thrown into prison, he's poisoned by the Kremlin, we think, where elections are rigged in Africa and Latin America, where people in China can't worship freely. Middle East, a journalist gets chopped into pieces in an embassy. And then you paint this country as somehow oppressive. I mean, honestly, isn't that just completely wild?
No, I think what's wild is to see the road we're going onto, and as the leader of a political party, not to call it out. We say that Donald Trump...
We're not at that point in... You may say what that direction we're going into, but you're putting this country in the same bracket as those others I've just been talking about.
Well, you've just listed a whole list of human rights abuses, which are atrocious, including the horrific human rights abuses going on in Putin's Russia. I think it's right to condemn all of those things. I think it's also important, we heard the phrase earlier from Priti Patel, axis of authoritarianism. I think that was actually a good phrase, but you have to include the United States in that. We have ICE, who are essentially a paramilitary organisation on the streets, killing people in cold blood.
We haven't got ICE in this country.
Well, we have the UK, though, saying that Donald Trump is a reliable ally, and we have a special relationship.
People say what they like. The point is we do not have people on the street whipping kids off the street into vans and shooting them. We just don't have it.
Well, we do have migration raids, and if we have, we just heard Reform being interviewed, and we know they're going down that road too. The problem here is Labour, at every single opportunity, whenever Nigel Farage says jump, they say how high. You will never appease the right by doing that. They will just get more and more extreme. And in Reform, we see an extreme political party. You just had Zia Yusuf on, who people will be disgusted to hear his comments on poverty. People up and down this country who can't pay the bills, whose bills are rising up, who can't feed the kids. To hear a politician, who we should say is a millionaire, sit in this chair and say there's only small pockets of poverty in this country, I wonder how people in Gorton and Denton will hear that.
Well, obviously we can't get into the by-election. Let me take you on to perhaps more familiar territory, or what we assume is more familiar territory. This week, Sky has been highlighting the scourge of fly tipping. As an environmental party, what would you do about that if you were in government?
Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that people have accessible ways to make sure that they're disposing of their waste. This is a huge issue. It's often described as antisocial behaviour, and I know from when I go out canvassing, it's often disgusting and makes the whole area feel a lot less livable in, and there's also lots of evidence to show that that can also increase crime. What we can't do, though, is just point fingers and say it's antisocial behaviour if after decades of austerity, there's not suitable ways for people to dispose of waste. I think more than anything, it's making sure that the big polluters are also being taxed properly, so the way that things are disposed of is part of the full circular economy, so that's also being paid from by the producers.
So wouldn't the simpler answer be just a straightforward improvement of surveillance, for example? I mean, you talk about Big Brother, but sometimes it's worthwhile.
Well, I think you can get into an arms race of surveillance, and ultimately people will always try and find ways to avoid things, and unless we're going to surveil people 24/7 all the time, and I often think that has to be the last resort. I'd much rather look at behaviour change and get people to feel pride in their place, and I think you do that by investing in the community and making sure you have a community centre, that people know their neighbours, and sure, there can sometimes be a role for surveillance, but it shouldn't be the first place we go.
Zack Polanski, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've heard a reference to the Gorton and Denton by-election there. 11 candidates are running in that seat. They are in alphabetical order by party on your screen now. Polling day is on Thursday, the 26th of February. And we'll have the full coverage and all the fallout here on Sky News. After this break, our panel's back. Plus, why it's a big weekend for Larry the Cat.
I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories.
This is insane.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
They call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News, get the full story first.
There's a fresh look to your news from 10 on Sky News.
It's a new show called The Wrap, every night of the week.
We'll still bring you the day's biggest stories,
but with more lively debate,
more in-depth commentary,
and more of what you need to know.
Plus a look at what's making tomorrow's headlines.
The Wrap.
Everything wrapped up for you from 10 on Sky News.
We're so used to seeing you with Rob. What's it like doing this kind of stuff when he's not here?
Yeah, I miss him. He just inspired me to be a better person. He's shown us what living looks like in the toughest and most difficult of circumstances.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
He had a beautiful death. This is about a dying person's choice to die peacefully when they want to, on their terms.
Go ahead, back white jacket.
Deborah Haynes from Sky News. He called you Daddy earlier.
No, he did it very affectionately. Daddy, you're my daddy. Thank you.
Leicester is on its knees.
They've ripped the soul out of my factory and there's nothing left.
It is eerily quiet.
It's constantly on the brink of capacity.
There's overcrowding. It's not a new thing.
It's rough.
There's nothing to hide. Why aren't international journalists allowed in?
Are you worried about escalation?
Of course I'm worried about escalation, which is why my focus is on de-escalation.
The region, I think, is on edge because they are anticipating a retaliation.
Iran retaliates for the US attacks.
Founding principle of the alliance, that an attack on one is an attack on all.
Could Putin attack another NATO country within 5 years?
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist?
They call him the king of the jungle.
Being a Sky News journalist.
Yusra Al-Bagher has this report, and this is what's left of it.
As a woman of colour, how did the Harris campaign speak to you?
People risk their lives to speak to us for this report.
Mr. Zuma, Sky News.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist? I'm going to take you behind the scenes here for Election Night Live. They have gone up and up. Big Sky News journalist. Ed Conway. Sky News, is anyone going to talk to us? Mortgage rates did go up very sharply during your time in office. Here it is. First off, just the scale of what we're looking at. Our data shows it's been happening. Question is, why it hasn't been stopped.
Now, we don't often celebrate birthdays and anniversaries on this programme, but today marks a special one. It's 15 years since Larry the Cat moved into Downing Street to deal with a chronic and ongoing rodent problem. His tenure in Number 10 is longer than all but two prime ministers, those being Robert Walpole and William Pitt the Younger. Keir Starmer is Larry's sixth boss. It's quite something. Happy birthday, Larry. Let's return to our panel one last time. Steve Richards, Kitty Donaldson and Ian Martin. Let me show you something else. Here is, we've got more Larry. I want to show you the turnover in Number 10 over the last 25 years. As you can see, as we move towards now, each of those vertical blue bars represents a change. Prime Minister, Cabinet Secretary, and so on. As you can see, it gets more frequent in the last 10 years. In fact, there are three times as many changes in the last 10 years as they were in the previous 16 years?
I think Larry should rule and kind of embody a model of political stability in Britain. I mean, the scale of turnover is insane.
What's going on here, Kitty? You have to deal with all of this on a day-to-day basis.
I would just take issue with you saying that Keir Starmer is Larry's boss. Every time I go into Downing Street, Larry is asleep in the sunshine on the windowsill. I think
you think it's the other way around?
I do suspect that. But on the serious point about the turnover, I notice look at 2016 on your chart. Do you think this is Brexit related? Do we think that that's when everything accelerated and this country basically became ungovernable, and that's what's speeding everything up? I think, and also the rise of Amazon. I think there's been an Amazonification of British politics. People expect delivery much quicker than is probably possible, and I don't think we give people in government a break enough to get on with it.
I think that's a brilliant point. I think that's what's happening. I mean, this is not, we shouldn't be ahistorical. Look back. There are periods in history, like during the Georgians and even during the Victorian period, where you get periods of very fast political turnover, and it's usually when there is massive technological or societal change underway that we can't quite yet process, and that's what I think is going on. I think the danger is that people see politics almost as a consumer business. They don't like a certain supermarket, they don't like a certain energy company, and the politicians are just in that same category. Whereas politics actually, when it works, it's of us. I mean, we should be part of it.
Of course, it's conceivable that we might start to run out of brands, though in fact. We've just been talking both the Greens and the Reforms, who are the insurgent brands right now. And it's very striking. We'll probably be able to pull up the polar coaster in a moment. But it's very striking now that Reform, as Zia Yusuf pointed out, has led in 200 polls, pretty much the whole of the last year. They're 8 or 9, 10% typically ahead. And Labour and Conservatives, who historically 75, 80% of the vote between them, are down to less than a third. That is a significant change, isn't it?
It is, but it's a massively... That chart, the previous chart, showing all the turmoil in number 10, shows why it's such an advantage to be an insurgent party, because the moment anyone moves into power, they're plunged into chaos, basically, since 2016. So if you're outside power and have never been touched by power, it's a big advantage at the moment. But I always go back to that 2017 election, largely forgotten. The two major parties, and the turmoil had already begun by then, Cameron had gone after 2016, got a bigger percentage of the vote together than I think, the 50s. So it's not that long ago where the two parties got a huge proportion of the vote. But for now, politics is fractured, and we've got the SNP in Scotland, perhaps going to win again. In a way it hasn't been in our history, actually, because we've got this schism on the right, on the left, and Plaid Cymru are going to do well in Wales. It is an extraordinary moment which makes politics so hard to read and fuels that instability in number 10. We've just had this extraordinary week with Keir Starmer.
Well, that takes us on to, we've got just a bit under a minute, so I'm going to ask you quickly what is now becoming the traditional end of programme question. How long has the Prime Minister got, Kitty?
I don't think Gorton and Denton will be the big turning point. I think the May elections will be the next flashpoint. But who wants it? I mean, and are the people who... Well, I mean, lots of people want it, but are they in a position to run?
He has a lot longer than he had a week ago.
OK. Steve?
We know more after this week. We know he wants to stay there, even without Morgan McSweeney. And we know that at this point, potential rivals aren't ready to go for it. We also know he faces a series of huge obstacles, but those are the dynamics at the moment.
Well, we're going to be asking that question again next week. See you then. 08:30 next Sunday.